I'm Miss Hattie from Olympian High School, and I'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley, starting on page 290, to describe the trade that developed after the trade in the Hellenistic world, starting with, well, we'll describe it as the Silk Roads. It's really important to understand that this wasn't just one road. This was a network of roads, so many roads that worked together, that are named after the principal commodity that was exchanged, which is silk, obviously. The other thing that you need to understand is that it had overland and maritime, that means over the sea, trade routes. Sometimes you'll hear historians say that it was just overland, and they'll describe the parts that are over the water, the maritime routes, as being sort of emerging Indian Ocean trade. But I would prefer that you learn it as having two kinds of routes: overland and over the water, or maritime. Okay, so in this class, using this book, we're going to describe it as having those two components. And this section is mainly describing to you sort of where that trade was taking place, the important cities, and the important commodities that are being traded, and the coming implications or effects. Okay, so here it's telling you about the establishment of larger classical empires is going to have the effect of helping to foster a larger network of trade. And it describes to you some empires that you've already studied. Like, it tells you about how the Han Empire succeeded in pacifying or making Central Asia more peaceful, which is going to connect them more to Bactria, which we've talked about as Afghanistan, Pakistan area, and to the west. The Parthian Empire is eventually going to displace or take the place of the Seleucids in Persia. Now, the Parthians saw themselves, as you remember from chapter 7, as being like true Persians versus these outsider Seleucids that were more Greek Macedonian. And they're going to extend their authority throughout Mesopotamia. And then the Roman Empire is going to also expand. You learned about the Romans in chapter 10, and you know one of the places they take over is the Antigonid realm in Egypt. So they're going to take over Egypt, and they're going to take over a lot of other areas. Now, in India, the Mauryan Empire is going to decline, but it's going to be displaced by empires that are supportive of trade, like the Kushan Empire and other regional states. So these are the states that are helping to foster this larger network of trade and exchange. As they get bigger, they expand this network of trade routes that links or connects much of Eurasia and North Africa. So as I mentioned, historians call these the Silk Roads because of the high quality silk coming from China as one of the main or principal commodities. The overland routes are going to connect all the way from China to the Roman Empire. Now, it's very rare that anybody would traverse such a long distance. Different parts of the Silk Roads were controlled by different groups of traders. But you should know that they stretched for a long ways. From the Han capital of Chang'an, you have the road going west until it gets to the Taklamakan Desert, also known as the Tarim Basin. It's a really dangerous desert. It's been nicknamed Taklamakan, which is he who enters does not come back out. And then the road split into two main branches, and those branches came back basically to avoid the desert. And then it came back at Kashi or Kashgar. And then from there, the reunited road went to Bactria or Afghanistan, Persia, and then forked off to Taxila, which leads to northern India. You learned about that in chapter 9. And then it joins with other roads going to basically Persia, so Palmyra in modern Syria. It was there connected with other roads from Arabia, and then keep continuing to go west. It's going to go to the Mediterranean ports of Antioch, which are in modern Turkey, and Tyre in modern Lebanon. I had a chance to visit that when I went to Lebanon and Iraq in 2018. Okay, so now you know where the Silk Roads are over land. What about over the sea? And it's important that because there are people that are going to tell you that they don't exist over the sea, you need to say, oh, actually, no. In my class, the way we learned it is that the Silk Roads did include a network of sea lanes. And you can describe some of these sea lanes to your friends when they ask you about it, because I know they're so curious. From Guangzhou in southern China, the sea lanes go through the South China Sea, and they link the East Asian seaboard to the islands of Southeast Asia. So there are these really important trade routes linking Southeast Asia with Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, and India. They were very busy during these times. And it tells you about other sea lanes that link the Arabian Sea to Persia. Okay, so all of these are over the water. Now, let's talk about the commodities or goods that are traveling. Now, what I would advise you to do is draw like a map of what's going where. Because if you read this book enough times, the repetition, you'll be able to memorize who's producing what. But if not, you might need a visual reminder. So we're all going to remember that obviously silk is going to be the main commodity from China. But silk and spices are generally traveling west. So from China towards Europe area. Um, silk from China because they had the best techniques for producing high quality silk fabrics. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, they're all coming from Southeast Asia. Also from China, ginger and cinnamon. Cinnamon also came from Southeast Asia. Pepper comes from India. Make sure you know that. Sesame oil from India, Arabia, and Southwest Asia. Spices were really important in classical times, not just because, the way we use them today, they make our food taste better, but back then they were seen as not necessarily, they didn't actually function in this role, but people believed them to have either magical properties or to make you less sensitive to pain, to be an anesthetic, to make you in the mood to make babies, an aphrodisiac, perfumes, aromatics, or even as drugs to cure you. So back then, spices functioned or were believed to have more of a function. From India, you also got cotton textiles and these items such as pearls, corals, and ivory. Central Asia and the Mediterranean lands also produced trade goods. From Central Asia, they got strong horses and jade, so that green stone that you see a lot of people making necklaces out of, that comes from Central Asia, and those were largely prized by the Chinese, so they wanted those jade items. From the Roman Empire, you get a lot of fine works of art, like glassware, jewelry, works of art, decorative items, perfumes, bronze goods, wool, all of these things that you see here. From the Mediterranean, merchants often brought in or imported raw materials like beautiful gemstones, and then they would make it into some beautiful kind of jewelry and export it as a type of decorative item or jewelry. Now, this next part is telling you that very few people traveled the entire distance of the Silk Roads or traveled a long distance of the Silk Roads. So Zhang Qian, who I mentioned earlier, is one of those examples. Another example your book describes is a man named Gong Ying, who traveled a long distance. There's also a supposed travel of a group or delegation that came from the Roman Empire that supposedly arrived in China, but we don't have very much information on that. But that was very rare. Most people did not go from one end of Eurasia to the other. Instead, they traveled in small stages from one section to the other. So here it's important to know who controlled which sections of the trade routes. So in China and Bactria, Chinese and Central Asian nomadic people dominate the trade. Then when they went west from there, what we think of as Persia, you have the Parthians really in control of those roads, overseeing the trade routes. Once you got to Palmyra, you see people who are from the Roman lands, like Greeks, Jews, and Armenians, on the overland trade routes, controlling those trade routes. On the seas, it's different groups of people who are controlling trade. Around China, it's mostly Malay and Indian mariners who are controlling the sea lanes. In the Arabian Sea, you have Persians as well as Greek and Egyptian subjects. That means they're being ruled over by the Romans on the sea routes. The Parthian Empire controlled trade in the Persian Gulf. The Ptolemaic Empire controlled it until the Romans took over the Ptolemaic Empire, because remember, the Romans are going to take over the Ptolemaic, and then they're going to control that trade. This is just a bunch of other information about Romans building a whole bunch of trading outposts in India, testifying to the brisk trade between the Romans and the Indians. And it tells you about all of these different colonies that the Romans established in India. You can read about that on your own. Okay, remember that Mare Nostrum refers to the Mediterranean. Your book had made a joke in chapter 10 about how the Mediterranean Sea didn't really become like a Roman lake. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. But the Romans obviously dominated or largely controlled the sea routes there. Okay, so because of all of this trade, things that used to be difficult to get, like Indian pepper and Chinese cinnamon and other fine spices, are going to be consumed with the wealthy people of the Roman Empire. They also have access to silk garments. Now let's talk about this painting. Here you can see the woman's body because her garment is so sheer, it's so thin that you can see her figure, her shape. That was a problem in the Roman Empire. What would happen is people would bring in dense, that means thick, silk garments from China, but because silk was so valuable and so sought after, people would unravel it and then reweave it into thinner items so that they could make the most use of the silk. And that led to some of the items being transparent, which caused some of the Romans to, be really upset. Like, we can't be seeing people having moral decay. Basically, they thought it was scandalous to be wearing garments that sheer. Um, so you can talk this, you'll read about their anxiety about this. But ultimately, this did not cause a bunch of moral and economic problems. If anything, it's going to encourage the economy, stimulate the economy. And the problem is going to come from other things that are being exchanged simultaneously, including biological exchanges like diseases. We'll also look at cultural exchanges. But at least now you know where the Silk Roads are, some of the names of cities along the Silk Roads, and some of the items that were traded there.